everyone, my name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Today is a little bit weird because we have vanilla people in my house right now. You might hear dogs barking, you might hear construction noise. It's wild, it's crazy, but I gotta film, so we are gonna roll with it. And today's subject, I think, is very important because we're gonna be talking about marks and bruising. Now, this is probably the most requested topic I've ever had for a video on my channel, at least that I can remember, that's coming to my head right now. And a lot of you guys really wanted to know about this based on the responses that I got to another video that I made that was called How to Take Your Masochism to the Next Level. I did briefly touch on bruising and marks in that video, but I really shied away from discussing it because frankly, I think our community has a little bit of a problem when it comes to talking about marks. It gets over-glorified, and a lot of people spend more time talking about the marks left over from a scene as opposed to how much they enjoyed the scene or the connection that they had with their partner. And I really worry about contributing to that idea that if you didn't get good marks, then you didn't have a good scene, because I don't think that's true at all. But a lot of you left some really good suggestions and ideas for how I could approach this without inviting in those more pernicious aspects. So that's what we're going to be doing here. So our focus is going to be a little bit more of a general overview of what marking is, different types and categories of marks, different types of play that give you those marks, and then yes, also I am going to give suggestions for how you can get better / more intense marks if that's something that you have been struggling with or just want to know more about. So if any of that sounds interesting, you are in the right place. Let's go ahead and get into the discussion. Now, firstly, what do I mean when I say marks? If you're new to the world of BDSM, you might be kind of confused as to why I'm using that terminology as opposed to other words that you might already be more familiar with. And I think there's a few reasons for that in the BDSM community. One is I think it's helpful to have a term that separates the results of consensual BDSM play from things that might be accident, like bumping your knee into a bedside table, or even something like domestic violence. And having a term that is more BDSM community specific helps to create that distinction. And also, mark is a really wide category. It's not just bruising, it also refers to welts, abrasions, cuts on the skin, indentations from rope, a bunch of other things which we will be going into in more detail in this very video. So it also gives you a way to refer to a bunch of things that happen in BDSM, all with one really handy term. Now, generally, marking by itself isn't really considered a form of play, it's more the results from play. And I think as well you could consider things like body writing to be marks, so that would be marks left on the skin from things like ink or henna, pen, marker, so on and so forth, even makeup. But for the sake of this video, I'm going to be making a distinction between marks left on the skin from things on top, again, like makeup, like pen, so on and so forth, as opposed to the physiological response of the skin itself from some form of stimulus. But why do people actually like marks? Well, first, I want to acknowledge that not everybody does. Not everybody enjoys looking at them. Some people have jobs where they can't have marks. Other people have vanilla spouses that might be uncomfortable seeing the results of a BDSM scene on their skin. And also, they can be itchy, they can be uncomfortable, they can be a pain in the butt to take care of, and they're just not fun for some people, and that's also totally valid as well. But for some people who do like marks, they can construct an entire scene over getting their preferred mark of whatever type that is, and that completely makes sense. It can be something where you have it almost like a badge of pride, where you get to look at like how intense of a scene you went through, and you can look at that mark and go, wow, my body was able to endure that. It can also serve as a reminder for the scene, a way for you to have a heartfelt memory of the experience left on your body that whenever you look at it, you are reminded of the scene that you went through. If you're somebody who is primarily long distance or doesn't get to play very often, it can be a great way to stay engaged with your headspace or to be reminded of your power exchange if you don't really get to do scenes very often. And also for masochists, it can just be dang fun to have a bruise to poke at. And I'm not going to blame anybody for that. Sometimes the reasons for the things that we enjoy are very simple, and that's just as valid as the reasons that are more nuanced, psychological, or complicated. And now for the big question. How do you actually get marks? Well, I'm sorry to say that the answer to that question isn't exactly clear cut. Every person's body is different, and so the way that your skin will react to things is going to be different on a case by case basis. So rather than giving you like a step by step, here's how every individual person can get marks sort of a thing, what I'm going to do instead is give you some factors to consider so you can kind of keep in mind, okay, here's how likely or not my skin is maybe to mark. And obviously with this information, you're going to have to experiment and just see what works for you. So some things that might impact your skin's ability to mark might be things like your age. It could be your diet. If you're somebody who is vegetarian or vegan, or somebody who's otherwise prone to low iron levels, that can impact your ability to mark. If you have a lot of sun exposure, the part of the body that you are trying to mark. It could also be hydration levels. It could be the pigment or the tone of your skin. It could be how much stimulus you have received to the area of the body before. The body is adaptive. If you are constantly hitting in the exact same spot for every single scene that you do, eventually your skin will probably toughen up. And this is backed up by anecdotal responses from people who say that generally speaking, bottoms who are more experienced with impact play on a certain part of the body will mark less frequently than people with less experience. You might also want to think about things like your stress levels or your body composition. Hormones can also play a big factor as well. So somebody who is testosterone dominant will generally have thicker and tougher skin than somebody who has a higher ratio of estrogen in their body. Also, if you are somebody who happens to go through hormonal cycles, if you have a period, where you are in that cycle can also impact your ability to mark as well. And this is why I really don't like using marks as a way to gauge how well a scene went, because you can take two people who have very different bodies, very different life experiences, give them the exact same scene, and they will have very different outcomes on their body. One person just might be a little bit red for a few hours, and the other person might have marks that last them for weeks. It really, really depends. And again, depending on all those different factors, as well as probably ones I haven't mentioned, you might mark differently in one day than the next day. You might mark on a different part of your body, better than a different part of your body. So it just, again, it's about experimenting. It's about finding what works for you, and then ultimately being able to communicate that with a partner if you do want to have marks as a focus of your scene. Now from here, what I want to do is talk about general categories for marking. So when I think about marks, I think it's helpful to kind of break them down based on how long they last. The broadest category, the one that is definitely more in the 101 skill level range, would be temporary marks. So these are things that generally heal in like a week and a half or less, depending on your body. The most common example of this would be bruising. So if you don't know, bruises are when there is bleeding underneath the skin, and that's what leaves the mark behind. Now, when I think about getting bruises, I would generally associate that with more thuddy forms of impact play. Impact play where the force is going more into the deeper layers of the skin rather than just sitting on top. It doesn't have to be pure thud, but I would think about things like, for example, using a thick paddle, or spanking, or flogging, or punching, or a baton. Anything like that that has a little bit more force generation behind it, that's going kind of down deeper, is more likely to result in bruising than something that's more superficial on top. Which relates to our next category, which would be welts. Welts are more like angry, raised red marks on top of the skin. I would describe them as having a little bit more of a burny sensation when touched, as opposed to a bruise that might be a little bit more tender. And with welts, I would generally associate this with more stingy forms of impact play, so things like canes or thin paddles or a ruler, or like really light, very like fast sort of spanking, as opposed to like, full on, very deep impact play sort of spanking. And so generally that's going to be more irritating to the upper levels of the skin as opposed to the lower levels. Generally speaking, welts will kind of just stay on their own for a shorter period of time compared to bruising, but sometimes welts can develop into bruising as well, particularly if you're doing a really long impact play scene or you're really focusing in on one area. And there is one form of play that results in marks that I think are really, really distinct, and that would be caning. For some people, caning results in more bruising. For other people, it's more like a welt, but no matter which way it is, it can be very distinct. So generally it has more like lines that go across where the cane actually struck the body. Typically that would be on like the thighs or the butt, and it's very distinct, and some people love caning. It's like the only form of impact play that they do, and it's the only kind of marks that they like. And if you haven't tried it before, if you like interesting, unique marks, it's certainly something worth giving a go. Rope can actually leave some pretty unique marks as well, because what rope does, when it sits on the skin for long enough, if it's tight enough, it will basically create indentations, which will then be refilled when the rope is released from the skin. For some people, this leaves kind of like a faint red mark for like a couple of minutes after a scene, and it goes away very quickly. And for other people, particularly if the scene was very long, it can actually last for several days afterwards. And if you're really serious about getting bruises specifically in a scene, I would actually look into cupping. And I'm going to do a whole other video where I just talk about what cupping is and kind of a little bit how to do it. But basically, it creates a partial vacuum on the skin that sort of sucks up the skin, and then that results in a bruise. It's kind of like a more refined way of giving a hickey in some capacity, and it gives very uniform, very precise, and reliable marks. Now, hickeys go along with biting, and biting is definitely another way to get marks as well. Like rope, this can leave sort of indentations on the skin that go away rather quickly. Sometimes it can result in bruising. However, with biting, you do need to be careful because the pressure that's typically required to actually leave behind a lasting mark can verge on breaking the skin, and not everybody's going to be super comfortable with that, so make sure you're aware that that's a risk of engaging in that form of play. Like biting, you also have play with sharp edges such as claws or knives, or even your fingernails by themselves can work for this as well. This tends to leave more of like a red line of irritation wherever it goes over the top of the skin. This is generally also quite superficial and does tend to fade quite quickly. For some people who do have a very adverse reaction though, it might stay for longer. And like biting, you do need to be careful of the amount of pressure you're using, because if you are trying to really get a mark that'll last, the pressure you might need to use on a sharp edge could be enough that you might also break into the skin. Now from there we have sort of the in-between category that I would call semi-permanent marks. This is generally not something you're going to get from impact play. I would think about this more in sort of the body writing type capacity that we mentioned earlier, so things like permanent marker or henna or fountain pen ink. Those would be things that would have a result that could last anywhere from like 4 or 5 days up to maybe 2 or 3 weeks. Also, interestingly enough, some people in the rope bondage community have reported that they get semi-permanent marking from doing TKs simply because they do so many of them over and over and over again in the exact same spot, and that can happen as well. If you're doing things repeatedly in the same area, it's more likely that your skin's going to adapt to that, and sometimes that means that marks are going to get left behind. And then the next category we have is, of course, permanent marking. This is really not a 101 category, so I'm not going to get into that in today's video very much, but these are basically marks that can last anywhere from 6 months to the rest of your life, and they can be quite intense and quite serious. If somebody is going for a permanent mark on purpose, there's sort of two broad ways that people achieve that. One would be scarring by actually cutting open the skin. That would be things like, say, a scalpel or a knife. You also have people who choose to do this with burns. Most commonly, this would be something called microbranding, also known as cell popping, or with more informal methods such as with a cigar burn. Again, this is definitely a more advanced form of play, not really something that I can cover in a 101 video in enough detail, but if you are curious about that, there are resources out there, and I encourage you to do your own research. And now, finally, the reason probably why you are watching this video is, Evie, how do I get better marks? Now, I'm going to give you guys a bunch of suggestions. Again, as I've said many times already, experiment, see what works for you, see what is inside your own personal risk profile, and hopefully these might help you get the results that you were looking for. Now, obviously we don't have any scientific data to back any of this up, so a lot of this is based on anecdotal evidence, but I have known many people who have achieved better results with some combination of these things. One would be taking a hot shower or a hot bath before or after a scene to increase blood flow, especially if you're doing this after a scene. If you've gotten some bruising, having additional stronger blood flow in that area may actually increase the amount of bruising as the marking develops. You can also take a mild, small dose of baby aspirin before a scene. This is definitely a controversial suggestion, but I do know people that do this. And with any kind of blood thinner, obviously make sure that it's safe for you medically to do so, and it's not going to interfere with any other medical conditions you might have or other medication you might take. Blah, 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 lots and lots of disclaimers, but some people do actually have very good results by taking just a really small dose of aspirin prior to a scene to thin that blood and help increase the ability of the skin to bruise. You can also engage in what is known as a cold technique. This is commonly associated with caning, i.e. with cold caning, where rather than going through a warm-up process before you get into the more intense part of a scene, you just go straight into the intense part of the scene. And the theory is basically that when you are shocking the skin without properly warming it up first, you are more likely to create injury on the surface of the skin, i.e. welts and bruising. You can also incorporate rope and bondage into this as well. So for example, if you do rope bondage over a particular area that is basically restricting blood flow in that section of the body, say around a leg, if you do impact play over on top of that area, you may have stronger marking as a result of having all of that blood kind of more trapped in that one location. You can also layer your sensations of play as well. So one thing that some people will do is they will actually do thuddy impact play first, and then they will follow that up with stingy play, and supposedly that will result in better marking. My theory for why this one might work is because the thuddy impact play is creating that trauma kind of deeper under the layers of the skin where it might not be super visible, and then the stingier impact play that's more on the surface of the skin is going to kind of make that trauma more apparent, because rather than going down here deeper into the skin to create that trauma, it's more on top, so you end up kind of with like more skin trauma all the way through. I don't know if that makes sense. If like anybody's a dermatologist in here, I'm sorry. Hopefully this makes sense. Again, these are all just theories. Also, obviously, you can do longer scenes. If you are doing scenes repeatedly, say, you know, every day for 3 days, or you're doing a bunch of smaller scenes really close together in a row, say over a weekend for a convention, you're also more likely to have skin damage as a result of that. Also, same damn spot. If you are a masochist, if you are somebody who bottoms for impact play, you're probably very familiar with this, but it freaking hurts when somebody goes over the same spot over and over again, right? Well, as it turns out, that might also be a better technique for bruising if you are really focusing in on doing one thing in the exact same area over and over and over again. You're really concentrating all of that force into one particular spot. And obviously, my last suggestion is to experiment, try things out for yourself, try different toys, try different types of scenes, see, you know, maybe even different times of day, how hydrated you are, what food you've had. All of that can impact your marking as a result of a scene. And that's basically everything I wanted to cover in today's video. Hopefully some of this made sense. Hopefully this helped answer some of your questions. This is actually a little bit shorter than I was expecting it to be, which is unusual for my videos. So if you have any remaining questions, anything else you want to know about, feel free to leave that down in the comments section below. If you like this, if you haven't already, please do subscribe. I make videos twice a week about all sorts of BDSM related topics. And finally, if you really enjoyed this, if you want to have access to extra perks and rewards, I highly recommend you go down to my Patreon. That's what makes this channel possible, and I'm also able to offer you guys extra videos, photo shoots, a Discord chat, a bunch of other things. So if you haven't checked that out already, please do. Again, link will be down in the description box below. If you already support me over there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you guys next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.